Hi, this is Sean Stone. Today we have part two of Douglas Dietrich and his research into the Satanic Empire that he discovered inside the US military. This is Buzzsaw. We recall for sure that there was a tremendous interest in Satanism in the 1980s coming out of things like, well, actually even earlier, from Charles Manson forward, I would say, from 1969-70 time period, from Manson all the way to the Zodiac crimes of San Francisco, the, what was it, the Son of Sam in New York, yes. The potential for, there was a lot of indications of satanic cults became very fascinating in the 70s time period. In the 80s, you had these child molestation cases, not just the Presidio, the McMartin case was a very famous one. Ultimately, as you said, the kids were often dismissed as being, having childish fantasies, and as a result, written off. I remember that time period, even for horror films, kids didn't believe, kids were not believed. The point was the parents didn't believe. They said, oh, kids have an active imagination, and so, don't listen to the children, right? And as a result, a lot of these crimes were written off. But what aside from this constellation of satanic activity within the military that you're diagramming, and your knowledge is very encyclopedic in a sense, it's so vast, but what is really behind it? If we go down to the influence, there's got to be something that's driving it to allow someone like Aquino this level of clearance and access. Who does he ultimately answer to, in a sense? You see what I'm saying?
Well,
what is he serving?
Right, thank you for asking. There has been a undercurrent of satanic culture that goes back literally hundreds of years, and what it originally started off with was the Hellfire Club, as far as we can understand it in a modern sense. And the Hellfire Club was kind of a group of noble people in the British Empire before it was even an empire. By that I mean it started off with a man named John Dee, who was the original 007. That was actually his name that he would sign his papers with. And this was because Queen Elizabeth at that time had a fascination with men's eyes. And so he would draw two circles as if they were eyeballs, and then draw a 7 over them to kind of show that he was the 7th man in line in terms of awaiting her pleasure and her commands. Now, 007 or John Dee was of tremendous intellect. He organized the first intelligence agencies on the continent of Europe, and because of this, he was able to uncover a Spanish plot to set all of England's forests aflame so that the English would not have lumber to build a fleet to counter Spanish invasion. Now, because of these tremendous intelligence coups, he gained enormous respect for his occult capabilities and was actually credited for raising the storm that scattered the Spanish Armada. So he's a fascinating character, and he was the last royally recognized sorcerer, but it took a negative turn when many decadent, sadistic, degenerate, morbidly inbred nobles took a lot of his magics and began to exploit them for their own purposes. They decided that they would make pacts with demons, and that they would essentially use this to expand British power throughout the world on a secular level, and they became known as the Hellfire Club. Now, most people are familiar with the Hellfire Club as a X-Men's villain team, but they're historically quite real, and people can look them up in a very serious research sense. Ultimately, their moment of glory came at the crowning moment of the Victorian Empire, when the subcontinent of India was conquered. Now, this helped them in two ways. They began to investigate Hindu Kundalini and various other occult techniques, very dark Shiva-like techniques of the more destructive gods of India and their prophets and their seers. And beyond that, they established what became known as the Great Hedge of India to promote mass sacrifice. Now, everyone's familiar with the Great Wall of China. Few people, if any, have heard of the Great Hedge of India, but you can look it up on a search engine, find out what you can. And the Great Hedge of India was based on the British ability to garden with tremendous success in a foggy, damp environment, And British gardens are some of the most renowned in the world because of the attention they pay to them. And hedgerows are formidable. The hedgerows in the bocage country of France were known as hedgerow hell to the Americans, because when the Americans invaded after D-Day, they lost far more men to General Irvin Rommel's in-depth defenses than they did to the invasion of D-Day's beachhead establishment itself. Psychiatric cases went up 400%. There are battles in which 40,000 men died. This is because Rommel had hollowed out the hedgerows and placed in mortars, machine guns. Every inch became a battleground. Now, the British, when they took down the common English hedgerow to the subcontinent of India in monsoon Asia under tropical climes, these hedgerows mutated and grew into what became known as mutant bocage, that ultimately they were able to grow into thorn bushes the size of the Great Wall of China. They divided the subcontinent of India into 4 quarters, north and south, east and west. They literally crucified the subcontinent on a crown of thorns, and they made sure that they got total control of who got food, who got medicine, whenever they wanted to, and whenever they didn't want them to. And by this, they were able to starve or create pestilence or plague conditions that starved millions and millions of Indians to death. It is speculated that they killed, in a nation of 1 billion people, around 100 million Asian Indians at the height of the British Empire. This was a mass sacrifice to the infernal gods, and the Americans got into the game in the Second World War, and Colonel Aquino himself told me, you know, Douglas, it's just like the ancient gods of Hellenic Greece that were beautiful, ornate. They were Aphrodite, the goddess of love. You had Jove, the father of all the gods. You had Ares, the god of war. Then the Romans came along, and the Romans were nothing more than a barracks culture. They were basically a garrison state with military capabilities and nothing else. They had no culture of their own, and they were so empty and void of any sort of depth that they actually stole the Hellenic gods of ancient Greece and militarized them. They draft Ares and turned him into Mars. They drafted Aphrodite and turned her into Venus. They drafted Jove and they turned him into Zeus. Or was it the other way around? I believe. But at any rate, aside from my lacking of classical context, what he did explain to me was the fact that the Americans did the same thing with the devils of the British Empire. That the devils that the British had raised were something that the American High Command wanted to control for themselves, and therefore they committed themselves to a militarily inviolable campaign in both Europe and in Asia of quote-unquote strategic bombing. Now, all of this bombing was turned into a joke in terms of operational efficacy. You had the death of 900,000 Japanese, 62,000 Italians. Basically, you had the death of many Germans, probably 100,000 at the very least or more. And all of this was based on strategic bombing. But none of it had any effect on operations in the field. When field commanders would beg the bomber command to bomb German supply lines, the bomber command wouldn't do so because it was too busy bombing cities. As a result, the Germans were able to recoalesce and reconvene, corral and rally all of their assets. And this led to the Ruhr River battles, the battles of the Hürtgen Forest, and enormous American damages and casualties on the West Wall that extended the war by over half a year, maybe 9 months. They refused to bomb German oil supplies, which led to Adolf Hitler's counterattack in the Ardennes forest, known as the Battle of the Bulge. They never bombed any rail lines to concentration camps, so all of the killing continued without halt. The end result was strategic bombing accomplished absolutely nothing on the military field of battle. And it is a statistical fact that German and Japanese production continued to increase and expand unabated. As a matter of fact, the Japanese suffered more infrastructural damage domestically from earthquakes than they ever did from American strategic bombing. So the only purpose to strategic bombing was killing people. And the
It was
British
terrible.
were in a race with their bomber command under a madman known as Bomber Harrison, who was so detested by the British people themselves that there were never any awards, recognitions, or statues that were ever officially approved for British bombardiers, ever. Only recently did they finally decide to build a statue commemorating the service of the bombardiers, but not the madman who led them, Bomber Harris. So it took them until 60 years after the war, or more, 65, 68 years, it's been almost 70 years, before they decided to even admit the crimes against humanity in terms of mass bombing. Well, this was a race of mass sacrifice, and the British were not able to keep their demons. The Americans inherited them, the British lost their empire, and the Americans gained the world. And so what the Americans have is these beasts that they must continue to feed. It goes beyond that because men like Kino and other men in the military high command began to instigate forces that hell itself recoils from. All demons are essentially elemental entities that feed off human suffering, human failings, human foibles. We are a food source. We're a cattle to them. They need us to exist. For that reason, all demons that we acknowledge within the occult inventory of diabology are entities that would never dream of exterminating humanity. They need humanity to thrive in order to feed off its corruption and those elements of humanity which fail. Now, what the Americans have begun to summon onto our plane of existence are what are known as qlipothic entities. Qlipothic is a Kabbalistic term, and the Kabbalistic tree of life has what is known as a shadow or a tree of death. This tree of death is an occult gram or graphic that tries to graphically convey the anti-universe, the world of antimatter, the world of anti-life. It is a cosmic drainage pit or sewer of failed universes and cosms. And within this maelstrom of failed universes that are incomplete, this is what quantum physicists refer to as the majority of universes, because the majority of universes, the mathematical equations of physics never equaled in the balance of equations that they have here in our universe, and therefore no stars were formed. And if no stars were formed, there can be no life. These are universes of absolute darkness, emptiness.
Like almost.
And along in those universes, it was concluded that there are entities that are anti-gods. When the Americans began to use such works as those of H.P. Lovecraft as a model of what is referred to as a tulpa, a mental focus that you can utilize as a crystallization, a visualization, an image which will aid you in basically realizing what it is that you're focusing on, then the Americans began to utilize all of the death and suffering that they caused in World War I and World War II towards the summoning of these entities and the binding of them. This is what led into the exploitation of extra-dimensional technologies that the popular image knows of, or the popular public understands barely, as Tesla, Montauk, HARP technologies. Now, if anyone were to study the HARP mechanism, one would realize that it is almost never active. It is very much a passive binding mechanism. And what is used to passively bind is what Colonel Aquino described to me. It is the equivalent of a thumb cup at a buffet table that holds locked in the thumb of a very large man. And so long as the buffet table is continually reset, then the man has no complaints. But if the feeding stops, that man could easily break his thumb cuff and overturn the table. Now, this is why America has been involved in nonstop, pointless war and suffering since the end of proactive prosecution of hostilities in the Second World War. The beast needs to be fed or it's going to break loose. So this is an enormous part of what I had to learn in terms of theology. I got an education in theology the wrong way, in the same way that I got a medical education the wrong way when I had to spend over a decade caring for my dying parents. So that is, again, something that saved Aquino from my exposure for quite some time. That I devoted all of my time to care provision, and it is only as of late that I've begun to speak to many of the atrocities, to put them into context for the American people. Now, it's important to emphasize the fact that Colonel Michael Aquino actually sued the United States Army to take his name off of the Criminal Investigations Division's, CID's list of alleged child molesters from the Presidio scandal. And he lost. He sued one of the first electronic information distribution company. This was prior to what we called the internet. Now, this company was a San Francisco-based company called Electricity, spelled Electrici. And the Superior Court case of San Francisco was case number 984751. Now, he lost. And they were saying that he was a child molester based on what the children were saying about what he had done to them. So you might say, how is it that this individual can have so much power and yet lose these legal cases? Well, in the case of the Army, they wanted to have something on him. And no matter how powerful a man is, Henry Kissinger or otherwise, other people who are working with you always want to have something on you. So they have things on Aquino that keep him in line. And one of the things that I have that keeps them in line is the fact that working so many years with him and with the Army in general, I was exposed to the massive incompetence, corruption of the U.S. military, the Department of Defense, and that enabled me to ultimately get a hold of a bargaining chip. Now, the U.S. military, the Air Force in particular, ran the nuclear missile system for many years, and they were so lazy, so incompetent, so corrupt, that the 8-digit nuclear code to launch the missiles was supposed to be changed every day on a daily basis. They knew none of their men would ever be able to do that on a nationwide and international scale. So they kept the nuclear codes as 8 zeros for over 20 years. So all the Russians do it, all the Chinese do it. Now, they never bothered to infiltrate American missile bases and launch the missiles, because who wants to start a nuclear war? But the point is, anyone who knew that, who was of a self-destructive nature in today's world, could have easily done so for that period of time. Now, what I got a hold of, thanks to the incompetence of the military sorcerers, and it's important to remember this, basically, CIA, through remote viewing, was establishing a permanent employment program for psychics, while the U.S. military, through men like Aquino, John Alexander, the James Channon, the military was setting up a permanent employment program for warlocks and sorcerers. Now, because of dealing with them on a daily basis as a Department of Defense research librarian, I was required to use the OCLC, oh God, what did that stand for even? The Online Cooperation and Library, oh God, the cataloging. It was Online Cataloging and Library Cooperation Program. That was in the 1980s. And I was required to use that to seek out grimoires. A grimoire simply means grammar, an occult text. And I was required to seek these out from museums, universities, and Aquino would use his international security clearances to claim that he had to access ancient texts, grimoires, scrolls, and scripts, fragments of documents from the biblical era as a matter of international security. And as a result, books, texts that they would never show to anthropologists or archaeologists for fear of damaging them, they were kept in refrigerated safes. These were turned over to Aquino, delivered like fine china by a courier, and the end result was he would conduct his rituals on site at the library where I worked at night, on the night shift, destroying documents in the incinerator. I couldn't do that in the day because it made the library too hot for the rest of the clientele. Now, when Colonel Aquino would work these rituals, the reason why he had to do so in the library is because per library regulations, they could not leave the library. We had them online from museums, universities. They had to stay on site at the library, could not bring them home, and not even he could break that regulation. So as a result, his covens would come on site at the library and conduct their rituals, and I was witness to hundreds of them. Now, through this kind of carelessness, I ultimately gained possession of the occult equivalent of the nuclear codes. And they cannot change them because it is what is known as a true name. It is a summoning call that will break the entities that they have summoned loose from the chains that they hold them in terms of basically very high intensity electronic technology. And so that is an important fact to keep in mind when I speak of this kind of phenomena. And certainly these kinds of entities, it needs to be remembered, were summoned by what is known as evocation. And an invocation is something that can bind the entity which you evoke. And the invocation and the evocation, these are viewed by the US military as basically a super science. Magic itself is basically like a video game cheat code. That's what spells are. And certain instructions are fed into the operating system of reality that changes that very reality around us. It rewrites on the fly like a write-only memory new instructions that alter the reality around us. Now, much of this is based on sonic keys, a calling. And what makes mankind unique is that we are the only species of sentiency which cannot be summoned. So reality is viewed by men like Aquino as Maya or illusion. And this illusion, it can be altered by men like himself who are bold enough to impose their will upon it. And so when you take a look at the super science of the summoning, what Aquino and many people who work with him have done is they have summoned entities using true names that are similar to a mathematical equation. So just as the old priest kings of Assyria called upon the city gods to smash their enemies and keep them safe, the Americans have taken originally demons and now what are known as anti-gods. And they are basically able to bind them. Now, in terms of what the anti-gods are afraid of, it is essentially, in most cases, what is known as the swastika. So it is this symbol that the Nationalsozialistisch, or the Nazi Party of the right, took up as their shield against American Satanists. Now, it is these swastikas and symbols that are used as a binding mechanism that repels the entities which are summoned and keeps them enchained in areas of places such as Hard. So that is an element that confuses many people who are not familiar with this kind of level of high magic, is the fact that swastika is a ward. And it is a ward that is far older than Christianity or the cross. So when Aquino went to Wewelsburg Castle, the Schutzstaffel or SS Castle of Heinrich Himmler in the 1980s, what he was conducting was a repression spell, an inversion ceremony to keep at bay for at least a little while longer the elder gods of the Norse religion, which the Nationalsozialists were trying to summon through their mass sacrifices of the Holocaust. So that is a war of magic that Aquino was engaging in and was the primary motivating factor for many of the atrocities of the 20th century. So this is the forces of which you speak, yes, that motivate the conflicts of mankind. Well, this put the modern industrial age wars into the context of religious wars.